Hey there folks, Standix here reporting for Press for Truth, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about hydro and get into some of the history of how this electrical grid is essentially already a part of the North American Union. Now, although it may seem like a dull topic, when you think about it, our entire lives revolve around electricity. Unless, of course, you're one of the lucky ones who are living off the grid, and if that's the case, then congratulations, you're not going to need this as a primer. But for the rest of us, let's begin with how this continent became so controlled. In post-World War II, times were good, and in these good times, a bunch of promises were made in the names of future generations. These so-called unfunded liabilities that now threaten us with a debt bomb set to go off as the baby boomers retire. But, of course, because times were good and expected to stay good forever, the government created high-cost hydro megaprojects and infrastructure. And we, the emerging generation, of course, are now left with the upkeep and the costs that will basically sometimes rival just how much revenue hydro is bringing in. See, when market demand is low, these financial costs do add up. When market demand is high, we have a problem of excess capacity. So Canadian hydro is far from a free market. It's been politicized since day one, with each province generating its own system. And of course, that hasn't stopped the federal government from making inroads with commissions and committees, but for the most part, hydro's been a provincial concern. Since the manufactured energy crisis in the 70s, there's been a concerted effort to bring all of hydro systems under this umbrella of this North American system. Now, before jumping into electrical energy policy, I think it'd be best to define some of the terms, because unlike trains or pipelines, where a particular resource is shipped from like point A to point B, well, an electricity network is sort of a balancing act. It requires producers to balance the input of energy at one point with a loss of energy at other points. And since electricity can't be stored, I guess, except in the form of water reserves, well, grids need to be constantly planning to meet these peaks of demand. And of course, the obvious problem for anyone watching is that we know that centralized planning is a failed system, and this isn't some theoretical idea. The so-called Great North American Blackout of 2003 is a perfect example of just the dangers of centralized planning and integration with the United States. Now, public ownership of hydro is almost as old as hydro itself. The cities have been enjoying the fruits of electricity back in the day. Rural areas had to go without electricity. So this notion of wealth inequality is there. Notice the parallels to today's arguments. This has meant that the government nationalization of electricity was getting popular. And in Canada, there was a power structure initially over who got to nationalize the industry, federal or provincial governments. And of course, since Ottawa had the constitutional powers over bodies of water, they managed to control the water resources of the prairie provinces up until around 1930. And Ontario and Quebec as well remained independent. So it was the provincial powers that did stop Prime Minister Mackenzie King's attempts to federalize hydro. Now, during the Great Depression and post-World War II, Keynesian hydro megaprojects were starting to become the norm. Unfortunately, electricity policy reflected supply and demand of that particular period. So once again, you've got just another clear case of central planners assuming that what's true in today's market is going to just remain the same in future markets. Of course, right after World War II, it was the cost of appliances, not the cost of electricity, that drove the electrification of society. And since electricity was a public utility, well, the government happily subsidized the costs of electric stoves and fridges and washing machines. In some rural propaganda programs, citizens were offered a set of appliances for a 5-year electrical package. And there were slogans out there such as, "Live better electrically," that were being pushed all over the people. People were being encouraged to just abandon their primitive hand tools for these new power tools. The very power elite promoted these tools as a mass production and consumption of electrical wares. So let's just step back and take a look at what happened here. Okay, electrical power was harnessed by men like Edison and Tesla. Tesla, of course, until just recently, was sent to the dustbin of history, and Edison's inferior inventions were being promoted by the power elite. And in Canada, since water resources were owned by governments, they saw that it was their rightful duty to make sure that electric utilities stayed under their control. Now, the Keynesian paradigm that governments can create jobs led to hydro mega projects being built all over the continent. Because of the nature of the electrical grids, the governments needed more consumers and customers to just absorb the demand. So they started this massive propaganda campaign to bring everyone under their electrical grid. There was never any kind of a chance for decentralized private individuals to develop their own electricity, however that may have looked. I mean, who knows? Some entrepreneur may have ended up rediscovering Tesla's work. But, of course, we couldn't have had that. Plus, governments can guarantee their bonds since they're backed by taxpayers. So that basically ensures their hydro utilities meant easy access to capital. Now, as Canada developed its hydro through the provinces, some of them did remain freer than others. Even to this day, Alberta has a mix of private and municipally owned systems, whereas BC, for example, is pretty much virtually owned by the BC hydro monopoly. Now, Ontario, on the other hand, has a bit of a different system where a bunch of producers work in certain regions, but all of them pretty much answer to Queen's Park. As each province developed its own hydro mega projects, well, problems started to arise. And most of these utilities were generating more energy than the provinces needed. And then beginning in the 80s, the pretext of environmental sustainability started to replace this Keynesian paradigm of mass consumption. But, of course, along with this global problem of environmental destruction comes a global solution of integrating all of the government systems. Now, obviously, of course, the U.S. and Canada have been working together since the 50s with the St. Lawrence River hydro development, which was part of the International Seaway System, extending for the ports of Montreal to, I think it was Lake Superior's Thunder Bay. And by the beginning of the 90s, the Maritimes were linked with the state of Maine, and the Ontario network became functionally integrated with the networks of New York and Michigan, as well as the interconnected grids all around Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. And Quebec also was working with the power authorities of the state of New York. And there's export strategies for energy flowing from Manitoba's Nelson's receiver corridor to the state of Minnesota. So despite this integration, and even after NAFTA was passed, U.S. regulatory policy prevented American utility companies from profiting in any way on any Canadian imports. Now, however, the American regulators have since relaxed most of their restrictions. But by the 90s, Canada was involved with the U.S. and Britain in orchestrating a world energy grid. The U.S. and the World Bank were involved with the planning of a centralized infrastructure for the developing world and the post-communist world. So it may seem trivial to some, but getting the world under one large electrical grid is one of the most primordial steps in world domination. Now, starting in the 21st century, governments privatized their systems. Well, although it wasn't necessarily privatization. Governments would contract out their ownership to a private monopoly, as much in the same way that the Federal Reserve is a private bank. Well, most hydro systems are undeniably crony capitalist, or I guess to use the less proper phrase, just all out fascists. Crony capitalist privatization never really went far in Ontario. We're at the 11th hour. An anti-privatization coalition led by public labor unions launched a successful legal challenge to privatization. In 2004, Ottawa funded an alternative energy white paper that urged governments and corporate interests to work together to promote green consumption. Just as governments before tried to sell us appliances as part of this Keynesian megaproject fiasco, well, now they're trying to take away our things in the name of environmental sustainability. Meanwhile, of course, this same white paper urged these governments and corporations to foster the idea of North American energy integration. Although FERC stands for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it pretty much acts as a North American regulator since Ottawa doesn't regulate any of the provinces. And yes, electrical energy policy is increasingly a North American game, where American authorities just overrule Canadian provinces, where Ottawa takes just a hands-off approach, and the provinces continue to privatize through crony capitalist contracts. Now, in Ontario, we can just totally see this process as clear as day. Literally, we see the wind turbines that are just destroying the natural beauty of the countryside. Now, I don't really care if you support wind turbines or not, or solar panels for that matter, because it's not the technology per se that I'm against here. It's more about how it's being implemented. I mean, did Canadian entrepreneurs install that green technology? Did they make the breakthroughs or innovate on something that the Europeans did? No. The Ontario government taxes the productive members of society, then they squander millions on useless mega projects that actually, in the long run, end up causing even more environmental damage. European corporations come to Canada and they partner with the Ontario government to build energy sources that people don't even want. And, of course, this process is highly politicized. Need I mention the gas plant scandal? The Ontario Liberal Party canceled the construction of a Mississauga gas-fired plant during its election campaign. So this was highly popular for that area, and it really did help the Liberals win that important seat. And, of course, the Liberals said it was only going to cost around $190 million. What ended up happening, the Auditor General later revealed that the actual cost of canceling the plant, just so that the Liberals could win the election, actually came to around $950 million. Okay, that is corruption. That's a political decision on a fundamentally important part of civilization, okay, energy. Where our electricity comes from and how it's delivered to us is no different from the same bad economics that brought down the Soviet Union. See, this problem goes far beyond Ontario or BC or Canada or wherever. This is something that affects all of us, and the only remedy is to recognize who the real enemy is. Because for every 10 people that you may talk to, you're probably going to get 20 different solutions to the electricity problem. Should we privatize or localize or Teslaize? And by that, of course, I mean, what kind of market will freedom produce? Well, I'll leave you with a Nicola Tesla quote today, because I believe if we study what he was studying and we look at what he wrote and what he was working on, well, we might soon find that these North American electricity grids are basically unnecessary and, quite frankly, totally irrelevant. Throughout space, there is energy. Is this energy static or kinetic? If static, our hopes are in vain. If kinetic, and this we know it is for certain, then it is a mere question of time when men will succeed in attaching their machinery to the very wheelwork of nature.